Thanks, Dixie, and thank you, Dr. Filene, for joining us this morning. Good morning, and Kuyana. Thank you to all of our museum's friends and colleagues who are joining us for this first keynote address of the 2021 Museums Alaska annual meeting. I'm Amy Phillips Chan, and I currently serve as president of the Museums Alaska board. This morning, I have the really great honor to share a few words about our keynote speaker, Dr. Filene. Dr. Filene holds a bachelor's degree in American University from Brown University and in a doctorate in American Studies from Yale University. He's devoted over 3 decades to the museum field as a leading scholar, curator, exhibition developer, and professor. And I think actually some of the participants this morning have had him as a professor. One of his first roles in the museum field included senior exhibition developer at the Minnesota History Center, one of the largest state history museums in the nation. He next served as a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where he led collaborative projects that connected students and community partners to explore historical issues with contemporary relevance. He went on to serve as chief curator at the North Carolina Museum of History, where he led the museum's exhibition and collections development programs. Dr. Filene is the author of Romancing the Folk, Public Memory and American Roots Music, and co-editor of Letting Go, Historical Authority in a User-Generated World. In 2019, he received a Fulbright Fellowship to work with the Helsinki Museum at the University of Helsinki, which advanced his goals to re-envision national museums to promote collective identity. In February 2020, on really the eve of the pandemic, Dr. Filene joined the Smithsonian National Museum of American History as Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs. After joining NMAH last year, he quickly pivoted to our emerging moment in history and launched Stories of 2020, which was a digital storytelling initiative that gathered public responses to crises unfolding across the nation, including not only the global health pandemic, but also protests of racial justice, economic crises, and political turmoil. Stories of 2020 really asks the public, how does it feel to be part of history? As part of the program, curators reviewed written submissions, the photographs and videos that people sent in, and published a selection of these stories online under themes such as healthcare workers, educators, refugee communities, and beer and brewing. So kind of as our organization as Museums Alaska strives to support the long-term sustainability and resilience of museums and cultural centers during this kind of COVID-19 era, which we'd hoped it was post-era, but we're still in the midst of it. Dr. Filene is skillfully equipped to help us leverage our resources that we do have. So this morning we have the pleasure of strategizing together during his presentation, Curating in Crisis, Seeking Opportunities Within Pandemic Constraints, and to really kind of envision some methods that our organizations can employ for taking a proactive approach to being engaged and relevant in this unprecedented period of history. So with that, Dr. Filene, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Amy, for that really nice introduction. I really want to thank Dixie for all her help in getting me organized here, and I really appreciate the invitation. As you alluded to, I think if I could be there in person, I would see some favorite familiar alumni faces from my UNC Greensboro days. So I appreciate the chance to connect with them and with all of you here. As Amy said, I am currently the head of Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of American History. So I oversee the exhibition, collections, and research functions of the museum. But I've had sort of a wide range of experiences. I started at a county historical society in Wisconsin, and then the Minnesota History Center, North Carolina Museum of History. So I've had a range of experiences, including those formative ones at UNC Greensboro doing community-based work. So today I want to talk about some of the efforts of the National Museum of American History to respond to the pandemic and how it's led us to innovations on some fronts, how it has stymied us on others, and what initial lessons I take from that mix going forward. As Amy said, on February 3rd, 2020, I, for the first time, opened the door at the staff entrance to the National Museum, fresh-faced and with a full head of dark flowing hair. A little over a year and a half ago, I reported for my first day of work, and I threw myself into the challenge of understanding an institution that operates at a scale and level of complexity that was new to me. So I have scurried and studied, and I scurried and tried to make sense of as much of this as I could. And then after 6 weeks, the world shut down, and like most of the rest of America, I went home and began unlearning whatever lessons I had acquired in those first 6 weeks. So I and the museum staff entered a world that I'm sure is familiar to most of you, of days filled with Zoom or Teams meetings, of delayed and canceled exhibitions, of online lesson plans and curricula for K-12 teachers, of virtual public programs, and of delivering keynote talks to beautiful Alaska without getting to leave your desk. As you know, we're not out on the other side from that reality yet, but after a year and a half, I do think it's time to consider what we've learned and what remains unresolved. I don't want to pretend that the National Museum of American History, NMAH, I'll call it from here on. I don't want to pretend that NMAH has figured it out, or even that we should serve as a model. We have a lot to learn, and the pandemic exposed some structural weaknesses. Over the last year and a half, though, some big plans had to go small, some were scuttled entirely, but 3 new and unexpected initiatives emerged out of pandemic conditions that have offered us some new ways of thinking about our work. These new projects differ greatly from each other. One is a collecting initiative, another is a live public program series, and the third is a digital story gathering initiative that Amy alluded to. Each of these came out of opportunities and constraints that were particular to the pandemic moment. Each built from our traditional role as a museum and extended it in new directions. These weren't our biggest or most expensive projects. They didn't get a lot of press attention, but to me, they offer the most lessons learned, ones that I think will long outlive the long pandemic. And while the shapes and sizes this work took may be particular to the particular weirdness that is the Smithsonian, in thinking about this talk, I'm hopeful that the content of the projects, the process by which we created them, and the shared takeaways that come from them will be relevant to your own institutions, whatever their focus or their size. As I'm describing these projects, I ask you to think about 4 key questions that I'll return to at the end. And these are: how do these projects meet audience needs? What voices are being heard in these projects? What does success look like in this work? And how do traditional pre-pandemic museum practices advance or hinder these projects in their impact? And again, I'll circle back to these later, but I'll be interested in your thoughts on these fronts or others during the Q&A portion afterwards. As for the 3 pandemic initiatives, perhaps least surprising is that one of them centered on collecting objects. Even by February 2020, the curators at NMAH, who specialize in medicine and science, recognized the significance of what we were living through and began seeking ways to document it. In doing so, we drew on a long tradition of collecting around current events, from protests and presidential elections to the 9/11 attacks. And I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully, to show you some of what I'm talking about. Dixie, do you see that?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great. Hang on. So there's a long tradition of what we call rapid response collecting at the museum, some of which included collecting around pandemics. But this pandemic has been particularly challenging event around which to collect. The breadth of its impact reaches so far that it touches on practically every aspect of life, not only health and medicine, but work, business, politics, education, food, race relations, income inequality. As well, we ourselves, the staff, have been living through this event, even as we try to make sense of it. So how can we get perspective on it? And finally, we have faced basic operational challenges. For the vast majority of the last year and a half, our building has been closed and our staff absent. In many cases, we have had to lay the groundwork for collecting through remote contacts, priming the pump, but stopping short of physically acquiring objects and bringing them into the building. As a result, the process has had a slow motion aspect at times, which has been frustrating to the curators. Nonetheless, we have an emerging set of acquisitions that begins to convey the complexity of this period. Some have straightforward links to the medical elements of the crisis. We have the original vial from the first vaccine, and we have the scrubs from the first recipient, Sandra Lindsay. We have the model that Dr. Fauci has used to explain the coronavirus to Congress. He offered that to us for our collection. Other objects reach out to address the pandemic's cultural and social impacts. Banners of protest, artifacts of effort to maintain traditional life practices, images showing the toll and the resilience of the pandemic among vulnerable populations. And now we're beginning to consider the commemoration of COVID. We've collected examples from an artist's installation in which she planted white flags to represent each death, her way of conveying the scale of the tragedy. This is from an installation in Washington, but she's earlier in this year, but she's about to reinstall 650,000 of these flags around the Washington Monument. While these objects are moving, most striking to me, actually, has been the public response to them. We have been deluged with requests for news stories about this collecting work and swamped with offers from the public to share more objects with us. To me, this response points to the fact that even though we think of collecting as an act for the future, it serves a purpose for the present, for us today. I think our constituents sense that they have been living through an historic moment and they are searching for ways to process what they have experienced. Watching the museum try to document the moment and participating themselves through their donation offers has become a way for people to bring order to the disorder that they've been living through, to begin creating a story that makes sense of the unimaginable. That desire to help people feel grounded and make sense of what they are experiencing shaped the second project I want to touch on, an online public program series that we launched during the pandemic called Pandemic Perspectives. The premise was simple. The series came directly out of a very traditional, long-standing weekly colloquium series in which researchers share their work, usually by reading a prepared paper in a meeting room with usually 6 to a dozen colleagues seated in attendance. Remote work, though, offered ways to reimagine this series. The organizers now had a theme, then and now, how our pandemic ordeal compares to earlier experiences. And the online medium allowed possibilities we wouldn't normally have had. We now could draw participants from across the nation and beyond. So each panel was set up to have one curator and then outside participants. For instance, the program on leisure had a curator, an outside scholar, and an inventor. Pandemic Perspectives topics in the series included pandemic pursuits, how your ancestors had fun at home, fear and scapegoating during a pandemic, voting during a pandemic, and comfort food during a pandemic. Most importantly, the series centered on an approach, object-driven learning. The organizers realized that the online program was a chance to offer virtually the kinds of behind-the-scenes tours that people always want, but that usually we can't provide. So instead of prepared talks, the panelists looked together at these objects and talked about connections, juxtapositions, and disjunctures. With 12 programs in 12 months, what had once been a sleepy colloquium series began to draw up to 600 people at a time. The third project represents a bigger departure for NMAH and the Smithsonian. 24 Hours in a Time of Change emerged from a recognition that even as quarantine conditions made a certain kind of collecting so challenging, the circumstances also opened up some new possibilities. The project began when associate directors, including me, from several Smithsonian history museums met virtually at the end of March 2020 to discuss whether we should combine our collecting efforts. We actually decided that our individual museums' collecting efforts were already so complicated that trying to combine forces would probably sink us. But we began a conversation about what was distinctive about this moment and what we, as institutions, really could contribute. Even as the tragic events were unfolding that spring, we felt that in some ways the most telling and the most transformative moments were the everyday ones. Working at home or not being able to work at all, holding school remotely, struggling to understand changing medical advice, entertaining oneself at home with family, loneliness. In all these cases, the American people had at least as much expertise as we did. We were living it, they were living it. Instead of somehow providing answers to these upheavals, our best contribution would be to enable ways for people to share and to hear one another. So instead of our usual position as expert voices, we needed to shift into listening mode. We decided to create a story gathering website, a chance for people to share their experiences. The premise was that everyone had a story to share and that small scale experiences counted too. To emphasize the point, the project was designed to take place entirely on a single ordinary day, not an anniversary or a milestone, just a day in the life of a country in quarantine. We picked December 11th, 2020, knowing that the arbitrariness of that decision added an element of chance to the enterprise. Would that actually turn out to be an ordinary day? Or might something extraordinary or quote historical in the traditional sense actually happen? Either scenario was fine by us. Pandemic constraints enabled highly unusual institutional collaborations. As you know, the Smithsonian is a collection of multiple museums, and it's notoriously hard for us to work together. But online, every institution is basically equal. And here was a chance to showcase one of the Smithsonian's strengths, the reach and variety of its units. We invited each institution to join, and 10 signed on. In doing so, they agreed to follow some simple ground rules, including each institution could ask just a single one-sentence question, to which users would submit responses. Users could then choose to answer as many as they liked by typing text, uploading images, or submitting a short video. As well, each institution agreed to stage a 1-hour online public program during the 24-hour period. That decentralized approach allowed us to take advantage of one of the basic strengths of the online medium, its ability to handle layers of information, to bring order to an array of choices, and allow users to pick and choose. As a newcomer to the Smithsonian, I was surprised at the extent to which this project was breaking new ground. From the very outset, we ran into a thicket of philosophical, logistical, and legal challenges. Many of them revolved around the basic question of what does it mean to collect digital stories? I naively assumed that once people shared their stories, assuming they filled out an online permission form, we could just keep them. but gathering, keeping, and collecting are really different things, at least at the Smithsonian. Just like with three-dimensional objects, formal official collecting of digital material involves a perpetual commitment to catalog, make accessible, and migrate from one generation of technology to another. And I found that our museum hasn't yet settled on an approach for how to handle large groups of digital items like this. I saw these items as a whole, a group submission, but the initial instinct was to treat them the way treat them as a batch of individual acquisitions. We had to go through steps in order to be able to handle them the way an archives would, as a batch collection. I also learned that formal collecting, as opposed to gathering with no long-term commitment to preserve, formal collecting triggered a host of legal requirements about privacy rights and contractual permission. So would our audience care whether their items were formally collected or just gathered and showcased? At NMAH, we decided that the distinction did matter, partly because our question prompt to users was forward-looking. We asked, what message would you send to the future about your life in these changing times? And in introducing that question, we explicitly used the metaphor of a digital time capsule. And we felt that this language, the digital time capsule language, implied a commitment to save what people shared with us. So we felt obligated to formally collect the stories submitted. And also, we truly felt that these submissions could be of interest to the future. So in the end, NMAH took a different approach than the other museums in this respect, and negotiated a separate set of legal language and permissions that allowed us to save and accession these items. I have to say, in terms of the 24 hours projects, this approach was probably a mistake. We spent months in negotiation with the Smithsonian's Office of General Counsel and Privacy Office. And for a program that we only had 5 months to create, which was super fast by Smithsonian standards, that was a problem. Things would have been much simpler if we had all followed the same guidelines. But in terms of NMAH's story gathering, we did end up with what we felt we needed. Launch day on December 11th was full of excitement and uncertainty because we didn't know if people would participate or not. We had no marketing budget, so we relied on individual museums and Central Smithsonian spreading the word through their online channels. In the end, we received over 80 submissions between 8 a.m. on December 11th and 8 a.m. on the 12th. And on the fly, we selected and posted highlight stories so that people could be inspired to join in, see their contributions shared, and read each other's. I can't say that everything came out the way we had dreamed it could be. I had hoped that following the 24 hours premise, we would have live programs at all hours of day and night. But our museum educators were not so eager to be staging online programs at 2 in the morning. So we ended up with 12 hours of programming, ranging from conversations about how the pandemic was impacting Navajo reservations, to how-to webinars on gardening, to music and poetry performances. Likewise, I had envisioned social media buzzing with lively back and forth conversations, sharing responses to questions like, where do you hope we'll be a year from now? Or what are your fears for your kids? Or what's your favorite movie during quarantine? But people who actually do social media for the Smithsonian expressed doubt about the medium's ability to sustain a national conversation like that. Instead of back and forth, they felt that social media is best at describing how we collect and inviting people to do something, in this case, to share their stories online. Finally, the number of submissions on that day is substantial, but it's not a large haul. Looking back, I wish we had partnered from the start with an established network, such as the Smithsonian Associates. Despite these limitations and regrets, I was so pleased and moved by the range and diversity of submissions we received. We received some harrowing tales of confronting illness and wondering if there would be a hospital bed. This person laments that his passport used to be a ticket to power and mobility, but now it's just an ID card for a country that he says is, quote, the plague state of the world. Other submissions were glimpses of everyday life, reimagined, sometimes with silver linings, like taking online music classes from Lincoln Center or instituting cross-country family Zoom chats on Friday nights. Meanwhile, since NMAH was doing the more formal kind of collecting, we designed our contribution to the 24 Hours project to continue for 4 months. Stories of 2020 offered people a chance to reflect on the endless year of 2020 on into spring of 2021. We ended up with over 300 stories, which we grouped into categories featuring themes of particular interest. So, stepping back, each of these 3 projects was a departure, something we never would have done pre-pandemic, emerging from circumstances we all hope never to face again. Most directly, they speak to a kind of emergency curatorial practice, ways for us to respond to losing our buildings, our staff, our audiences, our bearings. But I'm actually most struck by lessons that I feel will apply when we do have our footing under us again. There are some takeaways from this work that I feel we should carry with us going forward, even after the pandemic. As is so often the case, these lessons come down to questions. I feel that the best work emerges when you come to a project not with a set direction, but with an open mind and an inquiring spirit. Since the pandemic upended all the usual practices, we had no choice but to revisit foundational questions and accept answers that might be different than we would normally have expected. So here are 4 questions that I feel shape this work and that should stick with us going forward. First, what do our audiences actually want from us right now? Too often, I feel, our work, especially in history museums, tends to focus on what we want to say rather than on why or for whom. Even as our audiences were removed from us, the pandemic sharpened the idea that we need to serve them. The 24-hour story gathering needed to be for the participants, not for us. A lecture series that no one hears isn't public history. The stakes in this moment were so clearly heightened that we had to pay attention to them. But really, the stakes should always be heightened in this way. Even as we collect for the future and seek to make sense of the past, we need to do so in ways that serve people right now. Closely related to that question is another. Why us? Are we the right ones to provide what people want and need? Instead of having half-hearted impact in arenas where we don't have capacity, we need to be honest with ourselves about what we can do, choose areas where we can have impact, and seek partnerships where we want to extend our reach. That doesn't mean we should stop seeking to build new audiences. Absolutely, we must expand our reach, but we also have to acknowledge that to reach out in new directions demands effort and investment. Good intentions without impact don't actually meet our audience's needs. A second core question emerging from this work is, who speaks and who listens in this project? Institutionally, we're accustomed to hearing ourselves talk. As individuals, we have invested in our expertise, and collectively, we are invested in the professionalization of our young field. But there are many kinds of expertise, and we must be self-aware and intentional about whose voices are being showcased and heard in our work. Since life in the pandemic was so unprecedented, it in many ways dislodged expertise. The 24 Hours and Stories of 2020 project were built around hearing first-person testimonials in which people spoke authoritatively about their own experiences. Pandemic Perspectives was consciously seeking to share expertise, people equipped to bring knowledge that would be new to our audiences, but to bring together in conversation a somewhat wider and more inclusive set of expert voices. The third question to ask ourselves before we embark on this work: what is the treasure we seek? Each of these projects had flaws and missteps, but each did begin with a clear notion of what we hoped would emerge, what success would look like. The Contemporary Collecting Initiative, for instance, took off just as the museum was crafting a new collections plan. That plan says explicitly that, quote, "We prioritize objects that tell stories. We aspire to an illustrative collection that reflects the diversity of voices, experiences, and perspectives in our country," unquote. That means that we wouldn't collect just any pandemic mask. It had to be a mask tied to a person whose experience and reflection on the mask opens up the dynamics of the moment we're living through. And we don't need one of every kind of mask. We want an illustrative collection, not an encyclopedic one. We seek objects that tell stories, that reveal us to ourselves and to the future. The treasure we sought in Stories of 2020 was very different. We were privileging first-person personal accounts of the everyday, glimpses of ongoing life that would otherwise be invisible to the historical record. Finally, where will best practices help us and where hinder us? This is perhaps the touchiest question to raise at a professional conference, but it reflects my longstanding concerns about where professionalization has led to stability and growth and where it has created barriers to creativity and change. Best practices, meaning codified understandings of what proper work entails, they can raise the standards of our organizations and can increase our capacities to do effective and sustainable work. But they can also become a set of expectations that take on a life of their own. Sometimes they serve as built-in reasons to say no. The pandemic, by upending all the usual ways of working, almost instantly made certain practices obsolete. Formalities about professional presentation standards, for instance, largely went out the window. The pandemic perspectives panels were able to have much more freewheeling conversations than otherwise they would have. Other best practices, though, remained intractable, sometimes for perfectly good reasons. As I mentioned, our curators were frustrated that I couldn't let them physically collect while our building was not staffed. I felt that we simply couldn't have each curator build a shadow collection in his or her apartment. But as a result of this restriction, we struggled to meet the press's and public's desires to know what we were in the process of collecting. Since we didn't technically, officially own the objects, we weren't allowed to share publicly our intention to collect them. Perhaps this is a rule we should revisit. Likewise, I absolutely support the need to have privacy and permission standards for online submissions, but as we struggled to launch the 24 Hours Project, I felt that the Smithsonian's best practices were somehow not able to accommodate the differences between people sharing stories of making sourdough bread, and the sharing of legally protected, personally identifiable information. My point is not to criticize professionals for doing their jobs, but rather that we as a field need to at least ask ourselves if the, quote, right way to do things actually aligns with the goals and impacts we seek. So to wrap up, as wrenching as the pandemic experience has been, as eager as I am to have my colleagues back in their offices down the hall, as much as I yearn to see audiences crowding our galleries again, as painful as it has been to watch museums struggle and colleagues suffer, nonetheless, I do feel that the pandemic has in some respects helped us by exposing some key weaknesses, spurring creativity, and offering us new ways to move forward. Even as we strive to leave 2020 and now 2021 behind, those legacies and lessons will always be with us, and they offer us some opportunities if we're ready to embrace them. Thank you for this invitation, and I'd be happy to take questions, and I will post in the chat links to the 3 projects that I was just talking about. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Filene. We do have a few minutes if anyone had any questions. You can put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. I'm trying to see if I can see everyone in case someone raises their hand. I loved learning about those projects. Those are some big projects, and having experience with the Smithsonian Office of Contracting and Technology and Personal Identifiable Information. I know that struggle. It's a
Well,
fun.
I don't mean to downgrade the importance of their work, because
They're
it's
very
important.
important.
It's
Yeah.
important. But it did show that institutionally we are not aligned. We weren't at least aligned to be able to just do this in the way I sort of expected.
Yeah. It's very difficult to get a quick project up and running.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions?
Oops.
I have a quick fun one. What's your favorite thing that you guys have collected?
Well, it's kind of a serious one, but we're in the process of collecting a banner from a Chinatown protest. You saw a quick picture of it there. And what's so striking about it, it was a picture, it was a protest organized by residents of San Francisco's Chinatown, protesting anti-Asian violence and hatred. But it was in, I believe, March 2020. It was at the very beginning. It just made you realize, makes you realize how much, how attuned that community was to what lay ahead long before I at least really fully recognized it.
Mm-hmm. Ron, you have a question?
I have a question and a comment. I really appreciate what was said today, because it takes disaster sometimes to make us rethink things. I was reflecting that we had a Museums Alaska conference in Seward some years ago, when the lady who was responsible for putting together the collections that are in the 9/11 museum were being gathered. And she walked us through the process of how you collect things in the immediacy of the moment, and how you hope you are collecting things that are going to be appropriate, and then where you share them and save them. And I must say, it was just a wonderful presentation that had us spellbound, because that was a major problem. We had 9/11. But what was really interesting and sort of ironic is that we were sitting in the Sea Life Center in Seward during the conference. And the Sea Life Center was sort of a result of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And some of the funding from that event spilled over to create that institution. And I think we're in a very interesting place where we have to rethink things, and we don't know the consequences, but we need to be very careful and thoughtful about what we collect, whose voices we hear. And I just appreciate very much your comments today. My question for you, though, is, are you a refugee or someone related to Filene's basements?
Well, no, the short answer to that story is I'm not related to Filene's basement, which people don't ask me as much anymore, because that business is, I think, folded. My grandfather was a refugee from Hitler's Germany, Jewish, and his name was Finkelstein. His last name was Finkelstein. And when he came to America, he was advised to change his name, and he chose Filene. And I don't know why, except maybe that was a respectable Jewish family at the time. I don't know, but yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. Melissa has told me she has a question. Are you able to unmute yourself, Melissa? Let me see if I can find you. I'm not sure I can unmute you. You're unmuted. Are you able to talk? Okay, we'll work on that. In the meantime, Anjali did have a question as well. She said, if you could come out with a new edition of your book on sharing authority in museums, what would be the most important change you would make over the 10 years later?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I've actually thought about this because, well, just to back up quickly, The title of that book actually has a question mark in it, letting go, because even then, I and my co-editors and contributors, we weren't quite sure what to make of the opportunities and sort of the direction that that the web offered in terms of dispersing authority and sharing expertise. I was in many ways very excited about it, and as I guess you can kind of tell even from the 24 Hours Project, I'm still very interested in that direction. So there's a lot about that I think still holds. But I have to say that the last several years, the way expertise has been devalued and facts and evidence called into question has made me definitely realize that I'm still pretty committed, I'm very committed to critical thinking and evidence-based work, and that this is something we have to recognize as cultural institutions as we think about our role, how to value inclusivity, diversity of voices, how to really put our visitors and users in the position to be learners and creators of knowledge. That's how learning sticks, I think, is when people are in that position. But at the same time, we do have built-in institutional authority that our visitors are actually seeking. And so I think the answer has to be clear on what is fact and what is evidence, transparent about how we as institutions are weighing evidence and offering interpretations, and then invite people to make personal connections and invite personal reflection, but not in just a way. I don't think letting go means anything goes. And I think that set of dilemmas is something that if we were to revisit the book, we would want to wrestle with that even more directly.
It's a great answer. A great question too. Thanks, Anjali. So one more question from Melissa. I think she has her mic figured out, so she's going to ask it herself.
Oh, good.
Melissa, can you hear me? I think you're frozen. Oh no, she had it all figured out and now she's frozen. Okay, well, Haley has this question. Did you have any advice for navigating the challenges of collecting tragedy or difficult situations without coming off like an ambulance chaser?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, Haley. My sense of where we are as an institution here at NMAH compared to where we were 20, 25 years ago is that we're actually more cautious, and that we are seeing contemporary collecting not only as a way to illustrate something, but as very often grounded in contemporary relationships. So some of that boils down to really simple ethical standards. You know, when they were having protests here, Black Lives Matter protests around in Lafayette Square outside the White House, we would not go to that protest and pull a poster off the wall and take it to the collection. If we simply wanted a way to illustrate the protest, that would have been a very efficient way to do it, but we would never do that now because that would be interfering in the event. Likewise, we would be ethically allowed to pick up posters that were left behind and on the ground. And we might do some of that. We did that after January 6th insurrection. But it's the way we prefer to work is more, again, based on interrelationships and that. So our curators were out in Lafayette Square when safe, talking to the protest organizers and asking them what they thought should be selected to represent and what they were comfortable giving. And so we really are quite self-conscious about the ambulance chaser dynamic. It means that we miss some things. Obviously it does, but the goal is not just to amass stuff. It's to it's the whole process of it, the objects, the message, the perspective that comes from the person associated with the object, and then again, in many cases, that depends on a relationship, and the process is as important as the product.
Definitely. And then Melissa, last question.
Thank you for bearing with me as I was having technical issues. I appreciate your time and the thoughts that you've been sharing. And I'm wondering, as you spoke earlier about the struggle between gathering the information and keeping it for posterity and wanting to honor that with the information that you're getting from the public, but also working inside the museum, you have this need to do the job and to do the work that you're really committed to. And I'm wondering if from your experience, you could speak to how the balance of honoring that and yet keeping your team focused and upbeat, because it is sometimes stressful to have that balance. And I'm just wondering if you could share a lesson or two that you learned as far as keeping the team focused and moving forward in spite of those things that you have to recognize. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Do you mean the tension between keeping the team focused when we're trying to decide which of these modes we're working in?
I kind of mean, like, you know how it's very frustrating to not be able to do the thing that you want to do and not have those parameters.
Yeah.
So more of a basic, just from your seat, things that you learned that might be helpful for us who are trying to figure this out.
Well, I think it really helps to have as clear as possible definition of your project at the outset, including boundaries. And maybe that seems obvious, but I think sometimes we charge ahead and we say, we're going to push and make this project as big as it gets, as big as we can, and we'll just see what happens, when really we're probably better served by saying, where could we have impact, and where are we going to start reaching beyond our capacity if we just keep just reaching and reaching. And I think so sometimes it's about envisioning goals, acknowledging constraints, and seeking impact. And then I think I'm also a firm believer in that a collaborative team needs to actually be collaborative, and that means recognizing diverse and different skills. That is, everyone, I think, acknowledges that in theory. I think the challenge of trying to keep people from being discouraged or keep people motivated, it really helps to have a clear sense, a shared sense of message. And message doesn't have to be literally a declarative statement or historical theme, but message in the sense, this project is about hearing people's stories in the first person, and to take the 24 hours example. And so if there's that core understanding, that enables the team to prioritize and say, well, I could do this or that with this project, but really that's not the core of the message. And I think that sometimes having that shared touchstone, in an exhibit terms, we would call that the big idea, right? The big idea is the shared touchstone that you go back to. So it's not a personal conflict, it's a conflict, it's an assessment rather of where the project's going and what its core priority is for whom. So I don't know, that's a little bit all over the place, but it's hard work. I think we just have to remember that that one of the things that this experience has shown is that our cultural institutions matter to people, that we really are we're not saving the world, but we are making a difference, and that it matters to people, and that the more we can, the absence of our work has shown that now, and the more we can come together around some shared goals, I think the better, but it's not easy, I recognize.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Filene. Thank you all, everyone who came to listen to the keynote. We really appreciate it. Big clap.
Thank you.
Yay. I'm the only one on here, but everyone's clapping.
I'll put my email in here again if people have follow-up questions that we didn't get to. Well, thanks. I hope one day to get out there in physical form, but I hope you have a great conference.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm about to start the next session. If you are joining the tourism session, you can do so. It'll start at 11:15.